All right, so we're going to start our chapter 10 discussion. Chapter 10 is kind of so we talked about evolution, natural selection, Darwin, and how things change over time and how life has changed over the course of many, many years. So now we kind of focus on okay, so if you're going to say that is happening and things are changing, how do we keep track of all the millions and millions of different kinds of plants and animals on our planet? We have to have some kind of organization system set up so that we can keep track of things and see how they might be related and how many they might be different. So we have to have this system. So we got to talk about this guy right here, Carolus Linnaeus. He is Swedish, and back in the 1740s, he came up with a system called taxonomy. And taxonomy is a classification system in order to categorize plants and animals. It starts out really, really broad, and it gets more narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow as you go. It's got several steps to it, and we're going to learn about the steps, and I'm going to teach you a way to you can memorize the steps by using a little mnemonic device and kind of figuring things out. So Carolus and Linnaeus set this system up. I'm going to scroll through here. The first thing that you get to is called domain. Now, when I was your age in school, we didn't learn domain. Like, it didn't exist. They added it later. So the domain is really, really broad. That's the first, they call it a taxa, or the first level of organization. So the first level organization domain, it is going to be the broadest one. It's going to include the most creatures. So it's the least narrowed down here. So for example, in domain, there's three. There's eukaryotes, which is what we are. Eukaryotes are anything that has a cell with cell membranes, like organelles that have membranes around it. So you've got a nucleus with a membrane, you got mitochondria with membranes, you've got the cell as a membrane. So that's one domain. That includes a lot of things like us. There's also bacteria and archaea. So those are the three main domains. Then it gets more narrowed down. You jump down to kingdom, and there are 6 kingdoms of life. There are plants, animals, fungus, protist, and then 2 different kinds of bacteria. And so obviously we're in the animal kingdom. We move on to phylum. Phylum is even more narrowed down. It's got less creatures in it. Then you can kind of skip that subphylum. You can break that down. Then it goes class. That's more narrowed down. Then it goes order, then family, then genus, then species. So you can see that when it gets down to genus species, human beings were Homo sapiens. You might have heard that phrase used before to describe human beings. Every creature has a scientific name. So technically we're called, generally speaking, we're called humans, but technically our scientific name would be Homo sapiens. So the 2 things that get used when naming a creature is these last 2, the genus and the species. So we're Homo sapiens, like dolphins are like Tursiops truncatus, a cat is like Felis catus. So that's where that kind of all comes from. It's based upon Latin, I believe. Okay. All right. Oops. Let me kind of switch this off. Let's go down here. All right. There are a couple little kind of mnemonic devices here to remember all the steps of taxonomy. So it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So here are some phrases that you can learn so you can memorize all of them. So, dear Kevin's poor cow only feels good sometimes. So that goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Or Dutch King Philip came over for good steak. Or this one, which your parents will probably love. Dumb kids playing catch on freeways get squished, which is a weird one, but that's what I learned when I was in school. And it's weird. You'll remember that one. I mean, so that's how you remember the steps of taxonomy. And how it gets more narrowed down and narrowed down as you go. So this is kind of showing you that. So if they wanted, they're going to classify a dog here, and they're going to start down here at the bottom, kind of going backwards. So it's kind of like a pyramid. If you pick the domain eukaryotes, that's anything that has a cell nuclei and membranes and organized nucleus and organized cells. So that includes a huge amount of different creatures. So they put a whole bunch of things down here. So you got plants, insects, fish, rabbits, cats, so on and so forth. Then they switch it to the animal kingdom. So that threw out the plant. So the plant's not in plants in the plant kingdom. So that threw it out. And then they moved on to chordata. Chordata, that name comes from like your spinal cord. So you have a cord. So you have a backbone for the spinal cord. So obviously like a worm, jellyfish, octopus, they're not going to be chordata. They don't have a spine. They don't have a backbone. So that got rid of the insect because it doesn't have a spine. You hear my cat jingling her collar over there. Let's see. Then we move on to mammals. Mammals are going to be warm-blooded. They're going to be able to nurse their young. They usually have fur. So that gets rid of the fish. It's not a mammal. And then we keep narrowing it down. Carnivore, which means it's a meat eater only. So rabbits are eating grass and clover and things, so that takes them out. So now we've got our carnivores here. We've got our cat, fox, jackal, wolf, and dog. Then if we move on to the family, it's Candidae. Candidae, there's a type of dog food called Candidae. Candidae just means like dog-like, so it's dog-like in its appearance. So obviously the cat is not dog-like, but the fox, jackal, wolf, and the family dog have dog-like qualities. Canis, you've all heard of canines, like a canine would be another word for like a dog. The least dog-like of those would be the fox, so he's out. Then now we're down to the jackal, wolf, and the family dog. Then Canis lupus. Lupus means like wolf, wolf-like, because if you're a Harry Potter fan, Professor Lupin turns into a werewolf. So lupus means wolf. So that gets rid of the jackal. Now we're down to the family dog and the wolf. And then we get all the way down to the very, very end. We call it Canis lupus familiaris, which means familiar. So that would be our dog. And that's how we get from really, really broad to really, really narrow. And it shows you how connected things are. So it's pretty obvious that a dog and a plant down here at the bottom, they don't have a lot in common. So it kind of fits in with last chapter, showing how things are related, showing how things kind of branch off and go separate directions, or they stay on the same branch. So it goes down that department. All right. Let me see what I've got here. How I did this. It looks like it got chopped off. Oh, it did. Okay, so I'll have to do it like this. All right, so I've got two things here. On the left side, I've got one species. On the right side, I've got a different species. So let's kind of identify what we are here. So on the left, it's a eukarya, which means it has a membrane-bound cell organelles. So does the one on the right. They're both in the animal kingdom. They both have phylum Chordata, which means they have a backbone. They're both mammals, which means they're warm-blooded. They nurture their young. They have hair. Order, a primate. Primate means it has hands, like you and I have hands and fingers. And it has forward-facing eyes, which means they're not on the sides of their heads. So ours are in the front, so we can look forward. We can't see like on the sides as much. So other animals that have their eyes will not be less centered and more outward. All right, then it got chopped off, so I'll go over here to the rest. Family Hominidae, which means great ape. Genus Homo for the one on the left, which is Latin for man. On the right, it's Pan, which Pan is a Greek god. He had He was half man, half goat, I believe, and he played the. You always see him playing like the lyre or the flute or something. On the left, we have species is sapien, which is Latin for wise, and on the right, species is troglodyte, which means cave dweller. Troglodyte sometimes is used as like a derogatory term, like you troglodyte. So anyway, so what we have on the left is a Homo sapien, which is you and I, and on the right we have a chimpanzee. So a lot of things in common, and that's kind of how they classify life and keep track of it. All right, let's look at something else. I didn't mean to do that. How do I erase that? Okay, scrolling. Scroll up, please. Don't. Scroll up. So the second one here, just going to take a look at it. And then, if I can get it to the center. Yeah, come on. I want you to take a look at both sides and see what you think they are. So you maybe will pause this video so you can kind of look and make a guess. So on the left side, domain eukaryote, animal kingdom, chordata's got a backbone, it's a mammal, it's a meat eater, it's dog-like. Canis lupus, you might have, if you remember from the previous one, you'll be able to figure that one out probably. Domain, eukarya, animal, chordata, this is on the right side by the way, mammal. Artiodactylia, which means it has a hoof with even toes, so it's got either 2 toes or 4 toes. You probably heard of a pterodactyl, so that would be like 4-toed, I guess. So artiodactyl, even-toed hoof. Bovidae, which means it can digest plant fiber. Bos and Taurus. So you probably heard the word Taurus before. I know there's a Ford Taurus that you can drive, but Taurus, you ever heard you might shout Toro, Toro, or your sign, your astrological sign might be Taurus. So let's see what we have here. So on the left side, we just have a wolf. And on the right side, we have a bull or a cow. So that just kind of shows you where they break off. So they are similar with each other until you get to this branch. Okay, obviously a cow is not a meat eater. They have even-toed hooves. They can digest food, plants, and the wolf cannot. So that's where they separate. So when you name them, their scientific name, Canis lupus would be the wolf's name, and then Bos taurus would be the cow or the bull's name. So you just use the last two. You don't use all of that. So that's kind of how that works. And let me pause this. Okay, so one other thing that I wanted to mention here was something that we've already talked about, but I'm going to come back to it. So remember, when we talk about species is the most specific that you can get. And we mentioned that there were 3 rules to being in the same species. And let me just focus on those 3 rules here real quick. So let me get this. Rule number 1, the 2 things that are in question, they have to look similar. Actually, I'm going to pause this and type these out so you don't have to sit here and wait. Okay, so the 3 rules about being in the same species, and we talked about these, are right here. So 1, the 2 things that are in question have to look similar. They have to have similar physical features. 2, they have to be able to mate and reproduce successfully and have offspring or babies. And 2, their offspring have to be able to reproduce themselves. And so we always use the classic example of the mule. So if you take a horse and you take a donkey and you look at them, they have similar physical features. They have the same kind of body shape, same kind of physical features to them. So it looks like they pass step number 1. Step number 2, can a horse and a donkey mate and have babies? And yes, they can. And the baby between a horse and a donkey, the baby is called a mule. It's a blend of the two. So they pass the second step. But if you take mules and try to use them to make additional mules, it doesn't work. Mules are sterile. They're not going to reproduce. So if you want to make more mules, you got to breed more horses with more donkeys. So they failed the third test, and therefore a horse and a donkey are definitely not in the same species. So that's how that works. All right, so I kind of went through this description of Carolus Linnaeus and how he went about setting up his system of classification. So, and how he explained how life starts out broad and then we can narrow it down and narrow it down. And we talked about domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And you had a little phrase that you learn, like dumb kids playing catch on freeways get squashed. And you know that when you name something scientifically, like your scientific name, Homo sapiens, is your genus name and your species name. They just use the last two. Everything's got a scientific name. It's kind of a universal language that's used throughout the world. It just helps us keep track of everything, helps us organize life, so we can keep track of what's going on and how things are changing. All right, so this is, I'm going to post this on Google Classroom, and you can use this. You could also read in your textbook, and your textbook would be chapter 10, and let me go look exactly what lesson that would be. Just hold on a second, I'm going to pause this. Okay, I just went back and checked. It's chapter 10, lesson 1 is where this information comes from. And another thing that I want to point out is in scientific name, the book is going to call it binomial nomenclature. Nomial means like name, bi means two, so it's a two-part naming system. So binomial nomenclature, if that comes up, it's the same thing as scientific name. I think that's enough for this first little chunk here. I'm going to post on the week number 1 e-learning. I'm going to post a couple questions that I want you to answer that proves basically that you watched this video and that you understand what it is that we're talking about. And that'll be kind of like your checkpoint for this week. So, and then I'll make another one of these for next week, and we'll go from there. All right. Let me know if you need anything.